This week on Dig Me Out, 80s Metal. With your hosts, Jason Ziak, Tim Minichi, and Chip Midnight.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Dig Me Out, 80s Metal. Join us at Patreon to become a member of the Metal Union at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. Gents, we're back. And as we have been doing recently, we've each been picking a record. Jay went with Hanoi Rocks. Chip went with Salty Dog. And so now I am up picking a record that I only really got into in the 2000s, believe it or not.
Of course, keeping to the script of the show.
And the reason I got into it was because the band that Jay and I were in were going to cover one of the songs off of this album. We never made it to the stage with the cover. We ended up doing a Motley Crue cover. But there was a song on this album that we were going to do, and I ended up listening to the whole record back then and being like, "Oh, this is pretty cool." So
that was the first time you had ever heard the band in your life, or no?
Not the first time I had ever. Well, maybe it was. Because
you knew the ballad, right? From the second album.
I don't really think I did.
House of Pain.
I only knew the ballad from the second album because we did it as a cover for 80s Power Ballad Night at the famed Andy Mann's Treehouse here in Columbus, Ohio, which was a bar that had a tree growing through it. And our lead singer, Keith Jenkins, started with, I think it was maybe Chuck, Power Ballad Night. That went on for a couple of years. Actually, it's coming back this year. It's the 25th anniversary. It's going to be at the Little Rock Bar as a celebration of Andy Mann's. And Keith will be doing Power Ballad Night again on a Friday with Chuck from The Vague.
There you go. Maybe you can do House of Pain again.
My only exposure to Faster Pussycat was through our band covering their songs, which I didn't know. I had to learn the band and the songs at the same time. So no, I had no exposure.
If this is your first episode, the story here is Tim did not listen to this music in the 80s or the 90s in cases,
I listened to what was on the
did,
radio.
so
let's clarify that. I have a mixtape that has a lot of stuff on it, and there's Def Leppard and Bon Jovi and those kind of stuff that was clearly radio material. Yeah. Pour Some Sugar on Me, Bad Medicine, those types of songs.
So Chip and I are bringing more of the nostalgia part of it as well.
Right.
Not only being informed, but also we have emotional attachment to some of these records that you're hopefully going to be the counter to that and sort of give us a reality check. So that's good that you weren't familiar with it at the time, and it was a little later you came to it.
Right. And let's just clarify, just because I wasn't listening to this in the 80s doesn't mean I don't like rock and roll. I was listening to other rock music.
There are rumors out there.
That
you don't like rock music.
Yeah, that Spandau Ballet is my favorite album of the 80s, or band of the 80s, and I can tell you that it wasn't. No, I was listening. I was listening to rock music. I was just listening to what was being fed to me via the radio, so it didn't go deep in any particular category. This is my weakness.
Let's get into then. Before you do the history,
we didn't even talk about the band yet.
Yeah, let's talk about the band. But you mentioned the band, but then also Chip and I probably should share when we first heard them. The contrast when you first heard them.
We're talking about Faster Pussycat, and we're going to talk about their debut record from 1987, the self-titled record, which is "Bathroom Wall" was the song we were going to cover, and I don't think we could ever get the double guitar part or something. There was some aspect of it we could just never nail the song, which is why we never played it live, but we could do the Motley Crue song. So that's the one we ended up doing.
The Chuck Berry rhythms were not our thing.
No. So when did you guys, was this something that, as soon as it came out, you were invested in it or interested, or did you come to this a little bit later from a friend or a relative? Jay, what about you?
This is very early for me. So my origin story to this genre was I was a big Kiss fan in the 70s. Kind of lost track of music between 80 and mid 80s, probably 85. It was kind of like you, Tim, probably just listened to the radio.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw a Kiss video off of Crazy Nights on MTV, and it sort of ignited this whole new like, oh wow, I didn't realize that band still existed, and like there's other bands and blah, blah, blah. So pretty soon after that, or right around that time, going back to Keith again, he had a so this is a bandmate and mutual friend of Tim and I. He had a neighbor that was a little older, maybe a year or two older, and he was super into all these bands and was actually like reading all the magazines, but also like writing letters to him and stuff.
Oh.
And so he was turning Keith onto all of these LA bands at the time, and then I would get sort of buy boxes of Memorex tapes, and then I would you do the thing where they were, these albums are short enough that you could fit one on each side of a Memorex. So I think I had this album on one side, and I had I think LA Guns' first album on the B side, and just became obsessed with all these bands, right? And then one of the funny stories at the time, like becoming aware of them and listening to this record, was I think his name was Todd, the friend. He had written the band asking if he could join their fan club. So this would have been like before the album was come out or just as it was released. And they replied back with like a matchbook and a Polaroid of a naked woman, and written on the back of the Polaroid was, "You're in." So I was basically handed because I dubbed the consent from Keith, and I was handed that story, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is the coolest band ever."
And of course, you said, "Let me see that picture. Let me see the Polaroid."
Oh God, a 1980s Polaroid picture.
I would love to know if he still has that, but I thought that was a great story that fit this band pretty well. Chip, when did you find out about Faster Pussycat?
So Todd and I probably know each other because we're probably the same age. I'm a few years older than you guys. I don't remember how I found out about Faster Pussycat, but I do know that the album came out shortly after I turned 16 and got my driver's license and had the freedom of the road. And I had read about Guns N' Roses, who had not yet put out a record. They had put out the EP. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that first EP they put out, Live Like a Suicide. I owned that cassette. I would say that I still own it. It is one of those long lost. It's somewhere in my mom's house, but I have never been able to find it. It's probably worth some money. But so I was familiar with Guns N' Roses. I was reading Hit Parader, Circus, Metal Edge, all the magazines at the time. And I have to assume that's where I heard about Faster Pussycat the first time, was hearing that they were from the same LA Sunset Strip scene as Guns N' Roses. But what I distinctly remember, and this is something that the internet has helped clear it up for me, but I thought Faster Pussycat's debut and Appetite for Destruction came out on the same day, because I know that I went to this record store in Cleveland. It was a heavy metal record store called Shattered Records. Have you guys ever heard of that?
No.
So there were two cool like indie record stores in Cleveland. One was called Chris's Warped Records, and that was more punk, punk stuff. At Chris's Warped Records, in the back of the store, they had the bootleg video cassettes of concerts that you could rent. But there were no bands that I liked, so I never did. But then Shattered was right down the street. It was in Lakewood, border of Lakewood and Cleveland. Anyway, Shattered was like the guy that ran it, Frank. Kind of looked like he could be a long lost cousin of like Alice Cooper's. He had like long black hair, and it was definitely a metal shop. Every time you'd go in there, he usually played like heavy thrash stuff. You'd walk in and it would just be blaring. Anyway, I bought Faster Pussycat and Appetite for Destruction cassettes on the same day, making me think they both came out on the same day. But I think Guns N' Roses came out just a couple weeks before. But that was my introduction to Faster Pussycat, and I'll talk about this later. But I will say that right off the bat, between Appetite for Destruction and Faster Pussycat, I think Faster Pussycat at the time for me, when I first heard it, was more accessible. So like that, I like the Faster Pussycat album probably for a good month more than I liked Appetite for Destruction, until I really kind of dug into Appetite for Destruction. Yeah, so I bought those two cassettes at the same time, and yeah, that was my introduction to them, and have seen them a bunch over the years, both back in the day and very recently.
Well, I've only seen them once, and it was probably not the best time to see them, because it was in 2001 at the El Rosa Villa here in Columbus, Ohio. It was July of 2001. They played with LA Guns, and this was during the industrial era of Faster Pussycat, when they put out the Beyond the Valley of Ultra Pussy compilation, where they basically remixed a bunch of the songs from this album and the next album as industrial songs, and then added a cover of I Was Made for Loving You, and it was not good.
And tonight, I wanna lay at your feet. 'Cause girl, I was made for you. And girl, you were made for me. I was made for loving you, baby. And you're made for loving me. And I can't get enough of you, baby.
I remember he was relenting somewhat, and they were splitting the set. So there was like an industrial part of the set, and then there was like more of a traditional sounding version of the band for the second part of the set.
Right. So I probably should give a little bit of history that I know, and then you guys can fill in with your additional information.
History of the band.
The band was formed by lead singer Taime Downe after he moved to Seattle in the mid 80s. He's working at a retail, like secondhand clothing store called Retail Slut. And he's also, I think, doing sound or like involved with sound at the Troubadour, one of those clubs in LA. And guitarist Greg Steele comes into the Retail Slut store, and they strike up a conversation. They end up there kind of forming the band. And then later bring in Brent Muscat on the other guitar and bassist Kelly Nichols. Nichols, I believe, got into an accident on a motorcycle, and he was replaced. And that's when Eric Stacy from a band called Champagne Darling Cool came in.
Just Darling Cool.
Oh, just Darling Cool?
I think they might have been called Champagne prior to being called Darling Cool.
Got it.
They were called Champagne and then Darling Cool and then Darling Cool, I think, when they got... Do I have that right, or did I flip those two?
I think you're right.
I think it was Cool first, and then they got a label, and they changed it to Cruel.
Got it. Eric Nichols ended up going and playing bass for LA Guns.
Kelly Nichols.
Kelly Nichols, sorry. Kelly Nichols. And then they brought in drummer. At some point, they got drummer Mark Michals. There's no E in Michals, so maybe it's Michals. I don't know. And they signed to Elektra. And from what I read, it was a pretty quick process. And they didn't even have a full album of material when they ended up signing to Elektra. And they had to write sort of while they were in pre-production for the album. They worked with Ric Browde for the producer. He had previously had worked with Wasp. He had worked with Poison on their debut record. He had also done a bunch of work for Ted Nugent. Like he did Double Live Gonzo and Scream Dream and whatever, a bunch of other records. And so anyway, he was familiar with these bands, like these LA bands, and he also worked with like Jet Boy and Dogs D'Amour and some other ones that I don't even know who they are. The names sound familiar. So this record comes out, like you mentioned, it was July of 1987. It made it to number 97 on the Billboard 200 chart, which is not bad. I didn't know this until reading this for the show. On the song Babylon, which features like some samples and scratching, that's done by Ricky Rackman. He was Taime Downe's roommate at the time, and they ended up opening a club together called the Cathouse, and that's where DJ Ricky Rackman would spin records, and before he became an MTV icon, I guess. And they followed this up the next. It wasn't the next year. It was 1989. Wake Me When It's Over. That actually made it to number 48 on the US chart, and it went gold. So pretty good. I mean, that's a nice jump from first to second record. And then in 92, they followed that with Whipped. That made us number 90 on the US chart. And then there was a big break. And then in 2006, with only Taime Downe and none of the other original members, they released The Power and the Glory Hole. Terrible album title. On Full Effect Records. It was their industrial record. There's a lot of additional musicians who show up on this record, like CC DeVille, Coyote Shivers, Dragon from the Backyard Babies plays on that record, along with, like I said, a bunch of other people. Ed Mundell, who's the guitar player for Monster Magnet, or was for a period of time. And there's a lot of people on that record. And again, it's an industrial record. They do an industrial cover of These Boots Are Made for Walking, which sounds like a really bad idea, but that's what happened. So they have it. This is a band that doesn't have an enormous catalog. You know, the way you think of some of the bigger bands like Motley Crue and, you know, Bon Jovi, Def Leppard have like, you know, a dozen or more records. They only have really 3 records with their main lineup. And then there's one record with, you know, Taime Downe sort of on his own. And they did go through the whole thing where like there were 2 versions of the band at one point, where like Brent Muscat had the original version of Motley Crue, or no, excuse me, of Faster Pussycat, because he didn't like the industrial stuff and he called it the original band. And then Taime Downe was doing his industrial version. And of course there was fighting about that. At some point, they did get together in the 2020s and record a new song. So that's promising. Maybe we'll get some new Faster Pussycat music. I don't know that it's necessary, but kind of like it when bands leave the legacy alone. But anyway, at one point, Frankie Banali was the drummer for the band. Just noting that.
Wait, do you know what? Do you know why Frankie was? Did you read that whole story?
No, why was Frankie the drummer? Or, I mean, why was the drummer?
So Mark Michals, who was a heroin addict, while on the road, had heroin mailed to him on a tour stop.
Oh my God!
Was subsequently arrested, and Frankie Banali stepped in to finish out the tour. Mark Michals is one of those people who has never been seen or heard from again. Like if you you can troll too. If you scroll 80s hair metal message boards and websites, that is one of the great big mysteries about whatever happened to Mark Michals, and nobody has seen or heard from him in 30 years.
I remember that story. It was at the time it was like, what? Who thought they could get away with that? That's a crazy thing to do. And then in hindsight, I'm like, oh my God, that's so Spinal Tap.
It is
like that should be in the sequel if they're looking for storylines. Especially even with it happening to the drummer, because it's always the Spinal Tap drummer, and the fact that he just disappears is also so Spinal Tap.
What would be absolutely amazing is if the producer, because there is a Spinal Tap movie, right? Like you guys saw that.
Yeah, they're filming it right now.
What would be amazing if Mark Michals is their drummer, and like they finally found their one drummer, and this is it. He comes out of retirement and becomes Spinal Tap's only drummer.
Oh my God! So did that happen between the second and the third record? Because there's a different drummer for the third one.
I thought it was on the first record.
Well, he plays drums on the second record, and then Brent Bradshaw plays drums on the third record. Maybe when they were touring for the second record is when it happened, because that's when Frankie Banali, he doesn't appear on an album, he just toured with them. So maybe Banali came in for that.
That might make sense. Yeah,
that probably.
I just remember also being a big deal, just because I think at that time, I just have to put your mindset in like how much mystique there was around these bands, because you got such little information about them. So you just like, and the videos were really all you ever saw. So you would construct this whole like narrative in your brain about who they were. And so the fact that one of the members of one of these bands wasn't in the band anymore, to me, it was not something that occurred to me that could happen.
Right.
So it's like, what, why would they change? What happened? And then when you hear the story, you're like, oh my God, like, that's insane. Mm-hmm. So I just remember it being notable, not only from the story, but also it's just one of the first bands of that like 87 explosion that had a member change.
So there was a single released in 2022 called Like a Ghost, with a B-side cover of Pirate Love by Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers. The current band is really just Taime Downe with a bunch of people who are not the original members, and the animosity apparently continues between Downe and Muscat and Steele and all those the original members.
So you know what's funny? I'm remembering when we saw them at the Alrosa, Brent Muscat came out and played the traditional band set and then left. And the other guitar player, I don't know his name, but he had like the short hair, came out and then they did the industrial stuff. So they were trying to like tour both versions of the band at the same time.
So it should be said that like the current touring version has been around for a while. I would say that some of the members who currently call themselves Faster Pussycat have been in the band longer than any of the original. I think that I don't want to. So in the 2000 I don't know 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 period, LA Guns and Faster Pussycat shared a rhythm section. So there was, and I think that was when Jizzy Pearl was singing for LA Guns. So they had Chad Stewart. Ohio native Chad Stewart was playing drums for both bands, and Danny Nordahl was playing bass for both bands. And so they would come through Ohio and they play this club called Slapsy Maxie's, which was a strip mall bar. I think I talked about it in the Bang Tango episode, just a really small little hole in the wall. Both bands came through in probably a 6-month period, and the rhythm section was the same. Again, like I'm not. Maybe Chad should get credit, but it feels like Chad is sort of keeping these projects, like he kind of kept them going for a while when maybe these guys didn't necessarily want to go out or didn't see the value in going out, and he was like, I got a rhythm section for you, let's do it. So I think while he may not have instigated the sort of reforming and reforming and going back on the road, he definitely kept them alive and touring a lot in the first couple of years. I think they've got a pretty settled lineup right now. They're in good shape. Yeah.
Well, I think maybe the ice has melted a little bit because in 2015, Taime Downe was playing at the Cathouse with the current incarnation of the band, and Brent Muscat, Eric Stacy, and Greg Steele came up on stage and they played Bathroom Wall in Babylon together. So that, maybe they're on better terms and they're just not touring together. It's much better than when in the early 2000s when there was like public screaming at each other and that sort of stuff. So,
well, I would assume with some of these guys too, like if you think about it, if you've been in these bands and then you're not, and you probably move on with your life, meaning like you get another job and commitments, and then to go back, even if you're getting along again, to go back out and do a tour means like, what am I going to do? Quit my job? Like to do
it's a lot.
A month of Faster Pussycat dates? I don't think so. Like, even though they might be like friends and whatnot, to like actually go back out and do a tour is a whole other thing.
Right.
Yeah, it's a lot different touring now when you don't have any major live support, or maybe, I don't even know if they travel in a bus, to be honest. Probably a Sprinter van. Yeah, it's a lot different when you're in your mid to late 50s, maybe early 60s, to decide that like it's worth it to go play strip mall bars and that kind of stuff.
You kind of have to be at the level of where you can do the fly-in dates. Like you can, earn enough on a show that you can afford to put everybody on a plane and just rent equipment and do it that way.
Now, that being said, Faster Pussycat they've been road dogs the last, 10 years at least. I'll be honest, it's gotten to the point where I did not see them the last time they came through Columbus, because to Tim's point, they really have 2-3 albums, something like that, to really choose from. And they play a lot of the same songs. And they've been in Columbus enough. I saw them last year. I saw them the year before. I saw them the year before. Like, I'm not sure that I need to see them on this go around. It depends usually on who they're packaged with, whether or not I go.
Yep.
I saw them with Bang Tango at a surprise booking at the Ace of Cups, which is more of like an indie rock kind of club. I can't remember when that was, maybe 6-7 years ago. They're typically in one of the places that is known for hair metal, 80s hair metal kind of stuff. But that Ace of Cups show is definitely a unique booking for them. It was a great show.
Speaking of Bang Tango, there's a connection. Do you guys know the connection between Bang Tango and Faster Pussycat? Am I about to blow your minds, since we just talked about Bang Tango not too long ago?
Yeah.
The Newly Deads.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So when Taime Downe was in between versions of Faster Pussycat in the 90s, in 97, he formed the Newly Deads with guitarist Christian, spelled with an X, Christian Simon, Danny Nordahl, and Chad Stewart, who you mentioned the rhythm section. And then also Kyle from Bang Tango was in that band for a period of time.
And Christian is the guitar player who stuck with them to come back into Faster Pussycat to make them industrial.
But he's also the guy that you saw with the short hair. He kind of looks a little bit like Rich Patrick from Filter, a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Like Nine Inch Nails version of Rich Patrick.
and they did 4 albums between 97 and 2006. Now, personally, I don't think that like if he wants to do the industrial stuff, that's totally cool. It should have all stayed with the Newly Deads. Like, I don't think that introducing industrial to Faster Pussycat was ever a good idea, and kind of ruined the mystique.
That felt like, band. Hey, this is the kind of music I want to do, but like to get attention, we need to put a different name on it. That's what it felt like to me.
Right.
Which totally, like, I think diluted their catalog and sort of messed up the band for a long time.
Yeah. Well, instead of talking about the Newly Deads, let's talk about the record, the self-titled album by Faster Pussycat. Jay, let me start with you. Yeah. What works for you on this record?
Yeah, this is fun to go back to. I mean, I know it's so well. I mean, I just can't emphasize how many times I've listened to this. I would just, for months, it would be one of 2 albums I would just listen to on repeat. So going back, I found myself drawn to a lot of the album tracks that I hadn't heard in a long time. Versus, things like Don't Change That Song or Bathroom Wall or Babylon, which, you're going to hear on like the Serious Hair Metal station or on mix tapes or playlists or whatnot. I think what hit me was on a lot of those album tracks is they're like a more accessible both technically and musically version of, I guess, Aerosmith. If you listen to early Aerosmith, what's going on drum and guitar wise is, it's blues based, but it's also pretty like busy and complex at times. And to me, this is like a really like almost punk version of that. Like, how do we strip it down to its bare essence? Like this 2 guitar thing that's kind of blues based with a singer that can do these almost riff style deliveries in the verses, and then we can use kind of the gang vocals to do big choruses. So I really like how it distills down that idea into this really like concise 3-minute songs. Still got all the spirit of that style of 70s rock, but it's just done in a way that's like not overindulgent. There's solos here, but they're to the point. They serve the song. So I just like the packaging of the whole thing. And then I think what makes it unique is that it so well encapsulates that sleazy LA scene, which I was never at, but at least in my mind, like this record is just so from a lyric standpoint and also sound standpoint, just to me, it encapsulates it so well. Like, paints a very vivid visual picture for you, what's going on there and what life is like and what kind of stuff they're doing and, the parties and all that stuff. I think on the music side, just breaking it down a little further, there's some great guitar hooks on here. I think the Bathroom Wall hook, that guitar line. The chorus in Cathouse with those little trill parts that go against the vocal. City Has No Heart has a great guitar lead in it. There's some really well thought out signature guitar parts on here that aren't just like riffs or chords. Like, they are stand out and they're things that you remember. There's also some drum parts too as well. Taime's voice is really unique. I think it's, it stands out. It's in that Steven Tyler school, but he's bringing like this, I think, much more over the top expressive element to it. Gets in this really throaty delivery that's, delivers this emotion and grit, but it's not overly abrasive like maybe we heard on the Bank Tango record sometimes, where Joe Estate can kind of go to this screechy place where you're like, it hurts your ears a bit. I think he stays in this cool zone where he can go between this lower register, which works really well in some of the mid-tempo stuff, but then getting this throaty kind of emotional delivery that builds to a chorus or a cool guitar solo. I think I mentioned everything. The lyrics paint a great picture. The songs are concise, well structured. I guess the last thing I'll mention that worked for me is Taime is from Seattle. On their 3rd record, there's actually a tribute song to Mother Love Bone and Andrew Wood, and you can hear on the last song on the record, Bottle in Front of Me, there are some parts of that song, particularly vocally, if you really pay attention, you can hear the bridge between like 70s Aerosmith and Mother Love Bone, like how he stitches those 3 things together. And you could probably even hear it like in the Malfunction stuff that Andy Wood did in the 80s. you can see how he's inspired or influenced by this band, or they were influenced by the same things when from Seattle. There's like a little bit of you can hear that early Seattle thing going on from, I think, some of the stuff that Taime's bringing. There just happens to be in 1987, which is pretty cool. Like if you're super into 90s music and, your ears are kind of tuned to that, or you're a fan of Mother Love Bone, I think that you're going to hear some things here and there that are familiar, which is pretty cool. So that's what worked for me. How about you, Chip?
Yeah, considering the time period, they came up in a Guns N' Roses, Jet Boy, LA Guns scene. So it makes sense that the album sounds the way it does. Like you mentioned, Jane, there's Aerosmith, there's Rolling Stones. It's kind of a blues-based version of what you'd expect somebody who works at Retail Slut to come out with. Compared to the last episode, the Hanoi Rocks episode, I feel like if you showed me the picture of Hanoi Rocks on the cover of Oriental Beat, and then you played me this record, I would be like, yep, this is it. And so I think that they definitely, I'm holding up the cover for those listening right now. That looks like a Hanoi Rocks album cover, right? They all have the hair. There's some dark hair. There's some blonde hair. There's some hats. There's some bandanas and scarves and all that kind of stuff. Hanoi Rocks clearly was an influence on the look of Faster. The other thing I read today, too, is that the album was recorded super cheap. They were expecting a huge record deal because all the bands at the time were getting huge record deals. They played a show in Phoenix, like on a Wednesday night in a college town, and that was not their Friday night at the Whiskey LA kind of show. And labels flew in to see them, and they bombed. And they were expecting to walk out of there with like a $500,000 contract. And basically, the label came back and said, "We'll give you I think they said, we'll give you $50,000. And Rick, who recorded it, had just recorded Poison for about that much. And I think I read something like where they said that, or maybe they gave him something along the lines of like, they told him he could go up to 50, but anything that he didn't spend, he could keep for himself. And so I think they spent $35,000 on the record. So it was done cheaply. I think that going back and reading about this album, they were like, this is kind of a demo. So I think it sounds really good. It sounded really relevant at the time. Like I said, it sounded to me at the time when I first heard it better than Appetite for Destruction, of course, like my opinion, pretty quickly. It was just more accessible. Because I bought it on cassette, even going back and listening to it, like the first half to me is just like hit. Like I recognize those songs. I definitely recognize the second side for sure, but it absolutely was a side A listen for me, rewind, side A listen, rewind, side A, and every once in a while I'll throw on side B. So I feel like that first half of the album I could sing in my sleep. The second half was a little more like, oh yeah, I forgot about this song, especially the last couple of songs rolls in and Bottle in Front of Me. But yeah, it encapsulated what in my head 1987, even at the time, but even today, what 1987 Set Strip sounded like and looked like. It was sleazy. They looked like Hanoi Rocks. They just had a lot of sleaze. The Babylon is a interesting track. I don't know where it compares to when Anthrax did I'm the Man. Probably similar time period, but like, I guess had Aerosmith done Walk This Way? This seemed like to be breaking some somewhat new ground. Like bands like this were not doing kind of rap-ish type songs like Babylon. Let's see, there was one other thing I wanted to. Oh yeah, so just for fun, setlist.fm is only as good as the people who contributed to it, right? So it's user generated, and the idea is that people can go in and submit set lists for shows that they've been to, and so not every single show gets documented. But I was looking, the first half of this record, Don't Change That Song, Bathroom Wall, Cathouse, and Babylon get played. It's part of the set. That's part of it's been part of their set since day one, and it continues to be part of their set. No Room for Emotion, according to Setlist, has not been played since 1992.
Wow.
Smash Alley was last played in 2016, but only like a few times. It was part of the set, and a few times in 2001, 2002. Shooting You Down last played in 2019. It was part of the set in 2017 as part of the regular set. City Has No Heart does not, I don't think it shows a listing, or maybe it shows like 1987, like one listing. And again, I don't know that people were keeping track back in the 80s or even 90s of set lists, but it doesn't sound like City Has No Heart has been played very often at all. I'm going to skip the next song, Ship Rolls In. Bottle in Front of Me, again, has not been played since Setlist FM has been keeping track. 1989 was the last time it showed up on a set list. Ship Rolls In, the second to last song, was played on the Monsters of Rock cruise earlier this month for the first time since 1989. The top half of the record gets played a lot, and the second half doesn't get played a whole lot, even today. Not part of the
Yeah.
set.
Some of those songs you mentioned that don't get played a lot or have never been played are Brent Muscat's co-writes too. The Greg Steele, Taime Downe songs seem to be the ones that are either constants or the ones being brought back.
Yeah, I do think Smash Alley is probably when I try to exclude the hits, Smash Alley is probably my favorite song. And it actually, when we talked about the Bang Tango, there's that song on the Bang Tango episode that I said reminded me of Faster Pussycat, and I kind of put those in the same. I would put those back to back on a mix. It was the same band. I don't know if anybody would know the difference.
And I heard it's interesting that the Poison producer recorded this because you can hear like something on like Shooting You Down when it's just that guitar part.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot like that first Poison album. Just the tone of the guitar and the reverb being used, and yeah, that's interesting.
There's that book, that Nothing But a Good Time book, that documents the whole scene, and it was super incestuous back in the day. With Kelly Nichols going to LA Guns, Vicki Hamilton managing Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, and then she took on Faster Pussycat. There were members going in and out. So it kind of makes sense, sharing producers, but all playing the same clubs, all in the same bills. It makes sense that like there's a lot of similarity to those bands, especially kind of that like just before it blew up sound. Even a band like Poison, Faster Pussycat, who don't necessarily totally always sound the same, you can hear the similar. They had the same producer. I guarantee they played together back on Sunset Strip.
Yeah,
and I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, like I said, Faster Pussycat still plays. If they're not headlining, they tend to end up as like the first band on like a 3-band or 4-band kind of, shed show where it's like maybe a Poison and else would be on a show like that. A Poison, a Warrant, a Winger, and then a Faster Pussycat kind of thing. Like they didn't have enough hits to be at the top of a 4-band shed summer tour. But they definitely have enough hits to open those kind of shows.
Yeah, which is funny because in hindsight, I don't know that the Winger, from a sound perspective and a style perspective, I don't know that Winger and Faster Pussycat could be further apart. Really. I mean, I understand that they get thrown in the same umbrella for some reason, but if you're actually listening to those bands with any critical ear, they couldn't be more different. What worked for you?
Sorry, real quick. I do want to say I saw them. I have a good memory, not a great memory. I remember that they opened for Alice Cooper in '87. Fraley's Comet was supposed to be the middle band on that bill, and Fraley's Comet dropped out of the tour at the Cleveland. Like, they didn't play the Cleveland. I actually remember going to the show, and they had like posters up or signs up that said Fraley's Comet will not be appearing tonight. So it was just Alice Cooper and Faster Pussycat. But I saw that show. I am almost positive I saw them at this little club called Diversions, but I can't find any evidence of that show. So but I wanted to, again, for those listening, you won't be able to see this, but they did.
Nice.
So I was reading about, on that Alice Cooper, and
that's signed. All the signatures.
I'm sorry, a signed flat from the debut album. When they were on tour with Alice Cooper, I was reading that thing that I sent you, Tim, today. Is that basically the label and the publicist and manager were like, if you have an off night on the tour, go play a small club or go do an autograph signing or go to a record store, or go to a radio station or do something. Get your name out there. You got to do it. So again, here's a picture of Chip and Taime Downe at the Record Revolution in Cleveland, Ohio.
Look at all that hair.
I got one with Greg Steele and one with Eric Stacy.
What year is that?
That would have been 87. That might have been when they were on tour with Alice Cooper. Maybe they had an off day before or after the show. I think that was a long time ago, so I don't exactly remember.
Little Chip getting his picture taking the film out, putting it in the little envelope, dropping it off at the Walmart, or not even a Walmart. It would be
it was Photomat, probably, right?
At a Photomat, waiting 3 weeks to get that thing back.
And then, so just like with Bang Tango, when I saw Faster Pussycat at Slapsy Maxie's, I took that picture of me and Taime Downe, and I'm like, hey, we should take a 2010 version of this. And so we took. I have a picture of both of us looking a lot different 25 years later. But
I would imagine.
We
that would be
that photo.
But we still need that coffee table book.
Yes,
we do.
Especially the before and after, like the then and nows.
Yes,
would be a lot of fun.
All right, Tim, you're up.
Okay, so I do want to mention, you mentioned the Poison connection because of the producer. I did actually look it up because I had the same thought as you. Shooting You Down. They both start with the same chord. Shooting You Down. And look what the cat dragged in. Both start with an E minor. One is look what the cat dragged in is tuned down a half step, so it's a little darker sounding, but they're the exact same chord. So I had the same thing with you when I heard that first chord. I was like, "This is Look What the Cat Dragged In," because I know that song. That's a single,
right?
And obviously it goes in a different place. But so the reason I picked this record, I, like you, Chip, with Salty Dog, thought that this record is something that everybody knew. Like once I got into it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is like the first five or six songs are like, they must have all been huge singles, because I didn't know. And I figured out just everybody knew what those songs were. And it's like, no, actually people don't know this band very well. And I think what works so well for me is the fact that this band totally eschews the metal end of things. We've mentioned this with a few other bands. The new wave of British heavy metal is not present. And this is so interesting that it's using like Chuck Berry rhythms, leads that are that go back to like the 70s glam rock of like the Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers, and it's not at all what I would expect musically. Taime Downe has a perfect sleaze rock voice, and he's actually a really fun lyricist in that way, because he finds a lot of little fun trinkets of sleaze LA rock life to insert into these songs. But when you get to a song like Cathouse, which has this like Nicky Hopkins-esque piano that the Stones would use, like, it gives it such an interesting and unique flavor that very few bands, I feel like, Cinderella was on that, but Cinderella feels almost more mature, I guess you'd say. They felt like they didn't feel as rollicking and dangerous as this band. Like this band to me almost feels like the younger precursor, even though the album came out the same year, to Guns N' Roses. Like there's a mayhem in some of these songs.
Just got back from the best cat house in town. And at the best piece of Mona Lisa I ever found. And I'm going back to the best cat house in town to get some more of that cheap little tramp right about now.
Even though everything is tightly recorded and everything, just you get it from the attitude, there's a swagger to this record, which I think that comes from the blues based rhythms, the blues based progressions. I mean, a lot of these are just using straightforward blues progressions and 12-bar blues, and it's not that complicated. And then they layer two guitars, each doing, I like when they're doing the back and forth on either side of the channels. That's a lot of fun. Again, when I heard this, it was early 2000s. That's when I started listening to action rock. That's when I started listening to Helicopters, Backyard Babies, and that kind of stuff. And it connected to me to that. Like I could totally hear the Helicopters doing, I know they did covers of like Bob Seger and MC5 and Leonard Skinner. I could totally hear a band like the Helicopters doing Smash Alley, or the Helicopters doing Don't, or the Backyard Babies doing Don't Change That Song. Like, these songs lend themselves so well to being reinterpreted because they're such classic structures. And a song like No Room for Emotion, I mean, you could give that to the Black Crowes. That's,
yeah.
The lyrics are maybe a little off when he mentions like the radiation dripping down on my head.
I love that lyric.
It's a great lyric. I don't think that I don't think Chris Robinson.
No, Chris Robinson wouldn't sing it, but I just thought it was a super fun lyric. Like,
but it's got a
great way to visualize that.
It's got a great vibe.
Yeah,
and that sort of laid back bluesy feel. What's interesting is every once in a while in that song, it feels like they're going to double time it and go into something that's a little more punkier, and then they don't. And I like appreciate that like, this is our bluesy country song, and we're just gonna, and it's at number 3, which is a lot of times where you stick your single on these records.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting choice because they slow it down for that point. At that point,
I got no room for emotion. Yeah. It's like a cloud driven radiation right on my head. I got no room for emotion. Now I'm trying to make the best out of a bad situation. You take my heart, push it down the drain. I'm easy, baby, it's such a shame.
like you, I just love the overall presentation of this band. They look how they sound. There's nothing off with any aspect of this. You could, you mentioned Walk This Way. They came out the year before in 86. So, I mean, Babylon maybe was influenced by that. I like that it's a bit of a risk. It's not overly, there's a little bit of the scratching, a lot of like a little bit of sampling in parts of the song, but it doesn't feel like a complete outlier because of the rest of the song is pretty much in their wheelhouse.
It feels like an authentic, like, to me, it sounds like Beastie Boys, License to Ill.
Yeah.
But it sounds like an authentic, like, this is something they would screw around and do at the Cathouse. Like, legitimately having fun late at night. Like, it's not them trying to be anything. It's just them having a good time, which feels like authentic.
And at the time, if Ricky Rockman is DJing at the Cathouse and playing an Aerosmith song and then a Beastie Boys, and then, I mean, this is sort of a culmination of that world that they were living in. It doesn't seem too far out there.
Living in LA is so much of fun. Boy, you is ugly and your girlfriend weighs a ton. We were sitting in our car in a traffic jam, and the turd started screaming, "Ain't you think I can win?" No, we won't shut up with this battling on and on. Battling on and on. Shut up!
And I don't know if it was you or Chip that mentioned, Jay, but the drumming is really, really good on this record for, I know the production sometimes with it so big and echoey, but like on Bathroom Wall, he does a lot of really interesting parts that really, they set up the sections so well. And I think what the other aspect that I appreciated is the arrangements of the various sections of the songs, whether your intro, everything is well thought out. They're not like just rolling through to get to the next part. Each section has a feel, has a vibe, and it really makes for a cohesive album that is nice and short. I think it's, like 36 minutes?
Yep.
And the next record is like 60 minutes long. So you can tell the difference between, the vinyl versus CD or cassette versus CD, I guess. in terms of what their output was. But yeah, I just think like from a front to back standpoint, this record is just a lot of fun. It doesn't stick around. I think if this had been 14 songs, it would have been too much. Like 10 songs is a perfect length. And yeah, it's kind of a classic for me, even though I don't have it's not like I have a long list of records that I've listened to all the way, but this is one of the few where I really enjoy listening to the whole record. So is there anything that doesn't work for you on this record, Jay?
Not much. I think in hindsight now, it's kind of revisiting everything. I like Smash Alley a lot. It's probably the song that sounds the most generic, though. I think it could be any of the LA bands, but it's still a really good song, and I don't skip it. I guess my only major critique beyond that would be it could use a remix and remaster. I think the tracks are there. I like the charm of it. There's a significant change in the production value on the next record, so they must have got some budget out of the success of this. So I think it could sound like really good if they could get the money to go back in and maybe remix it or even just remaster it. It's a little brittle here and there. It can use a little bit more like low end oomph. You really got to crank it to kind of get it, which is fine. But I realize, not everybody can do that to get it to sound good. So just, I think sonically, first Poison album, I would probably have the same critique if you ever get around to talking about that one. Just has a little bit of that like it's a little small and brittle, and it has that like kind of hollow reverb sound to it. So I wouldn't mind a touch up and a reissue of it would be super cool. Other than that, it's got a little everything too. It slows down, but they don't give you a ballad here, but they do give you some moments that are a little bit more mid-tempo, or like No Room for Emotion, I think is a cool like Stones mid-tempo groove song. You got the honky tonk piano that comes in. You get this break in the middle with Babylon, which is just this fun party song, which I think was the end of side one, which was kind of a neat reset to then come back, and sort of deliver side two, which is to me with time, I really enjoyed those tracks even more now than I probably did at the time. There's just a lot of nuance, I think, in those in the second half of the record. That's cool. It's got some great riffs. I think the lyrics are probably underrated for the genre. I think again, this is one of those records where there's so much misconceptions about this genre because we use this term hair metal, but when you get into these, it's like it's actually not very metal, and the lyrics are not. Yeah, there's some double entendres on here, but they're kind of fun. They're not obvious all the time, and at least they're clever. And I think it does a really good job of like capturing a moment in time, in a very visual way lyrically. It's relatable and kind of fun lyrically. And I don't think there was nothing on here where I was like, I can't believe he said that, or that's a little awkward to listen to now. So yeah, it's hard to critique much of it. I think it does. It knows what it wants to be. They captured that and they delivered it. Did anything not work for you, Chip? Especially like, with 40 years of hindsight.
Yeah, no, everything works. I would say it's not the album that doesn't work for me. There's something about like I usually I would tend to skip over Cathouse probably on more recent listens, and I will say nothing to do with the song and the record. It really has to do with seeing them as many times as they have in the last 10 or 15 years. They change Cathouse and they always saying it's the best whorehouse in town. And the first time you hear that, you're like, oh, they're changing the lyrics, and it's sort of funny, but it like it lost its sort of funny. I don't know. Like
right.
That song now, like when I hear them play that in the set, I'm like, oh, guess what? They're going to do it for the people who haven't seen them, and everyone's going to be like, ooh, they changed their lyrics, and now it's whorehouse instead of Cathouse, and so that makes me just not want to hear the song live. But but yeah, outside of that, and again, that's not a critique of the record; it's just a critique of the more recent live performance. But short of that, no, this is Tim, like you mentioned about me with Salty Dog. Even you saying that not everybody knows this, I'm like, you're wrong. Everybody knows him. Like, yeah, everything works for me.
Yeah, the only in terms of if there's a track that doesn't work, there's no tracks that don't work. I actually feel like Shooting You Down is the least of the Faster Pussycat sounding songs. Like it's the most straightforward. It doesn't have any bluesy element, doesn't have any like swagger. It's just sort of a straightforward 4/4 rock song. It could have been done by, you know, another band, but again, it still has their musk on it. I don't know how else to put it.
Muscat.
Their Muscat on it. I did notice. So you mentioned like there's one song over 4 minutes. Everything else is 4 minutes, under 4 minutes. There are no songs under 4 minutes on the next record. Most of them are 4.5 minutes or longer. So I think that's where you see some of like the bloat come in, is like every song has an extra minute now on the next record. Yes, it sounds different. It sounds cleaner. I remember I'm familiar with House of Pain. I know Poison Ivy, Slip of the Tongue, you know, those Where There's a Whip, There's a Way from that record. It definitely sounds cleaner, but they also have they're a little fattier. And I really like this record because it just sounds like a classic bluesy rock record. It's almost more of a blues rock record than it is a glam rock record in that sense. And it definitely draws more from the Stones than, say, you know, any sort of 70s metal. You know, there's no Black Sabbath in this. There's no Iron Maiden. There's none of that. Like,
no, I mean, it amps up I think the attitude to where you get in this kind of metal space. Maybe vocally, you could say some of it kind of gets in his throat voice. You could hear it. But yeah, I think that's why I was so excited about to do this podcast, because I think we're going to hit on so many of these bands that are considered like stereotypical of the genre, but when you actually break the records down, they're not at all. They have so much more to offer that people just, I don't know, either don't consider or just haven't heard or heard it that way.
And it's nice to hear a band that's like so kind of fully formed in terms of knowing what their sound is, knowing what the presentation is on the first record. And I can see why it got difficult going forward, because I feel like when bands have that figured out on the first record, then you go, well, what do we do for the second record? We just make the same record over and over again. And then, you know, Taime Downe is kind of into industrial music. So then that kind of throws things haywire. But like, I listen to this and I go, oh, this is a band that could have covered Personality Crisis with, you know, without thinking about it, like totally in their wheelhouse. But then the Dolls really were only a one album, you know, band. Like, where were they going to go after that? They made more records, but they never lived up to, you know, what they were capable of after the first, or what they were displaying on the first record.
I think there is a cool, hopefully we get to the second album, maybe even the third in the 90s podcast, but there is a growth there that I think makes sense. For some reason, he grew tired with it, or it didn't fit for whatever reason. After the third record, they just decided not to pursue that growth anymore, unfortunately, and went in a totally different direction. But there is a progression, at least for a little while, that, you know, it seems logical and worked. And the rhythm section is solid on this record. You know, this is a sound that can be difficult for some bands. Oh, I think we had trouble with it, like making it sound full and tight and have a groove. And
you got to swing.
You got to swing and play it a lot and like sort of just be in this mode. And, you know, it's, you know, I think it's a testament of probably a group of guys just playing a ton and working through it. And like they captured it at the right moment where like it was just starting to gel. It seems like that's probably what you're hearing on this record is like, oh, this is the sound. Here it is right now. We're just figuring it out in this moment. As it's being recorded.
I mean, you've been in bars where there have been thousands of terrible blues bands.
Yep.
And you think, oh, it's just 12 bars. You're just playing essentially 3 chords or 4 chords, and then playing some solos in a you know, E minor or A major or something like that. It's not that simple. Like there is a whole groove that is hard to capture that non-seasoned players think is easy, but once you get up on stage and you have to do it, it's not quite as simple as it sounds.
Or we've all heard like very technically capable players play music of this style, and you're like, your brain is saying like, okay, yeah, I mean, it sounds great, I'm making air quotes, but like I'm not feeling anything.
Right.
It's not making me feel anything, you know. So it's unique that you get this like, and I guess that's where I'm going back to the original comment about I guess punk is the only word I can think of. There's just this raw energy to it that's just technical enough to make it interesting, but it's got this energy of like human beings in this moment figuring it out, you know, trying to write fun, concise, poppy songs, with kind of a blues feel.
To your point, Chip, I think my comment about Fully Formed is because they didn't have time to think about it, what came out was the best, like, tip of the tongue, like top of the head, whatever was there ready to be unleashed. It was like, do it. Let's just do it. Let's not overthink it. We've got limited amount of time. We don't have a lot of money. And so the performances have an edge to it. Like it's a little bit this. I would have loved to have seen them like right when this album came out, because I have to imagine those performances were fire, of them playing these songs. You get a little faster when you play live. It's a little louder. It's a little more raucous. And this, to me, this could have been, if they broke up after this album and then there was never another Faster Pussycat album, this would be legendary, I think, this album, because it's so specific to itself, drawing from non-traditional 80s glam influences, that it would be up there with like something that is, a one and done, that people are like, man, wonder what a second album would have sounded like from that band. Not that the next album's not terrible. It's just a little bit longer in different respects, but yeah. So I guess when we get to the overall ratings here, I'm not going to be surprised with whether we're going with worthy album, better EP, or decent single. Jay, what do you say?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I said everything I can on this. It's a worthy album.
Yeah,
where you at, Chip?
Worthy album.
And that's 3 worthy albums. I hope people, especially if you are on the fence about 80s metal, 80s glam, 80s hair, whatever you want to call it. Like, I think, especially if you're into stuff that's a little more blues rock based, but I hate saying blues rock based because I'm not talking about Joe Bonamassa here. I'm talking about little scuzzy, back alley, that garagey, the true like sleazy Sunset Strip.
Yeah.
This to me embodies that. It is a whole world that is constructed for you. In some ways, it could be a concept album about Los Angeles in that time period. The only thing they didn't do, which would have been the cliche, is to close it with like an acoustic closer about shutting down the bar at the end of the night or something. But
that's what makes it so great, is there's not a moment like that on here.
Nope.
I think maybe some people would, I don't know, maybe scoff at Babylon. I don't know, but I think I like that song now more than I did then. At the time, I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of like them doing a Beastie Boys song. I'm not sure if I'm into this. I mean, it was fun, but it was like, I'm more into the guitar stuff. But in hindsight, like listening to the whole record together, I think it's another piece of the puzzle of like painting this picture of this scene, which I think is so effective. And the fact that they didn't do that sappy moment is right on, because I don't think that scene was. I mean, look at the lyrics for "No Room for Emotion." Right?
Exactly,
it's very much about like living in the moment. We're not over sentimentalizing or being over, nostalgic or sentimental about it.
Well, for folks who have enjoyed this, you can join us and the Metal Union at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. We have also a 90s podcast, 90s rock podcast available at those URLs as well. And you can head on over to digmeoutpodcast.com to suggest records for future episodes by going to our suggest an album link. We've got some suggested records, and we've got our first, is our second poll winner will be coming up soon. We have polls at our Union website at Patreon where you can vote for what records we'll be discussing on these episodes. Got a lot of cool stuff coming up. We're not going to share any of what we're doing. Oh, wait, Chip wants to share something.
Tim mentioned how you can suggest an album for us to review. I recently had the chance to interview Sebastian Bach, formerly of Skid Row, and I asked him that very question: what is an album that we should review on the Dig Me Out podcast? And here is what Sebastian Bach had to say.
So you were asking me some 80s metal records that people might have missed or don't know about? Okay.
Yes.
Number one, well, I'll go. Okay, number one is Malice in the Beginning.
Okay.
It's the first record by an LA band called Malice. Best way I could describe them is they sound like Judas Priest if they were from Hollywood. Okay. And the vocals, everything. And I gotta say this. When I was recording the first Skid Row record, my favorite album was this album, Malice in the Beginning. And if you listen to the very first song called Rockin' With You, you will hear a very early influence of Sebastian Bach's vocal style and attitude and groove and feel. And when I joined Skid Row, we got signed by Atlantic Records, Malice's label, and I turned around the back of that record. I said, "Who produced this?" It said, "Michael Wagner." I told everybody, Michael Wagner's producing our first album. And it was because of Malice.
Awesome.
And also Motley Crue. But right at that time, I loved that album. And so did Dimebag Darrell. So there's two good reasons there.
Substack. That's where our newsletter is located. It's where the 80s metal lives. It's where we send out a weekly newsletter of new releases of 80s, 90s, and aughts relevant music, books, documentaries, etc., as well as history of the band for various bands that show up in our polls. You get a little nugget of information straight from our Substack. And then lastly, Apple Podcasts is where you go to leave positive feedback for the show. So for Jay and Chip, I'm Tim, and we'll be back next time with another episode of Dig Me Out 80s Metal.